The mysteries of the Earth have captured the imagination of humankind since the dawn of civilization. Even today, with scientific and technological advancement, these questions of the unknown continue to challenge our perception of what we call reality. My name is George Popov. I'm a writer director, and I've spent most of my life creating make-believe stories, trying to find the truth through telling lies, and continuing the same legacy of folklore and legends that have been passed down for thousands of years. But for some of those tales, truth and lies do not relate in such a simple equation. When the line between fact and fiction is enshrouded in mist and shadow, beyond that threshold is a place that can change our perspective on everything we think we know. I call this place the SIDEWORLD. In many ways, the picture-perfect countryside village is a defining staple of Great British charm. From their characterful public houses to the inviting village greens, these small communities often take great pride in their homes, protecting rustic traditions and continuing customs that have been handed down through generations. However, behind bolted wooden doors and beneath the thatched roofs, dark secrets are harbored, giving light to violent and disturbing histories. Luckley in Kent has been featured in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most haunted village in Britain. Said to be a hive of paranormal activity, an abundance of ghostly encounters from over a dozen unique specters has brought light to many sinister events that lie in the village's history. Today, its aging structures of commune and worship are thought to house an unexplainable atmosphere that has visitors questioning whether they believe in the afterlife. The first point of call for those searching for a supernatural welcome will be one of the 3 pubs in the village dating back to the 14th century. All 3 are said to house an array of specters. One reputable establishment, the Black Horse Inn, is said to be haunted by a particularly playful regular. With personal valuables of staff and customers being hidden in strange places, this poltergeist is widely believed to lurk in the dark corners of the pub, waiting to play his next prank on the unwitting victim. When the pub is empty after last orders, witnesses have seen glasses slide across the shelves on their own, and cutlery moved from tables and arranged in neat piles on the bar. The next stop on the Phantom Pub crawl is the now closed Blacksmith's Arms, a pub that previously held the nicknames the Spectre's Arms and the Ghost's Arms due to the multiple encounters that have been reported. Some claim to have spotted a Tudor maid in the building, along with a coachman who was regularly seen staring longingly into the fireplace. Others have said a cavalier from the English Civil War roamed the upstairs at night, plodding back and forth across the hallway. And finally, the Daring Arms has seen many a ghostly sighting, with hazy figures stood in the bar, most notably an old woman dressed in clothing from the 19th century. This impressive building was originally a hunting lodge for the prominent and wealthy aristocratic family, the Darings, who lorded over the area from the 1400s right up until the First World War. In the reign of Henry II, the Daring family rose to significant wealth and stature through dealing in items sought after by the upper echelon of society. The first Baronet, Lord Daring, created a renowned library inside his mansion, including many rare manuscripts, maps, and even the first known collection of Shakespeare's original, handwritten plays. Another of his claims to fame was an act of gallant bravery during the turmoil of the 17th century's English Civil War, when he was almost captured by the notorious parliamentarian Oliver Cromwell. By the skin of his teeth, he managed to escape, supposedly diving through a narrow round-top window. Later, he would ensure that his manor house be made with all the same windows in this very style. Daring windows were adopted by the village in order to commemorate their lord's achievement, which of course he encouraged. The third Baronet, Sir Edward Daring, was also known for setting up a regiment for the military in 1689, the 24th Foot. This regiment will become revered for their ingenuity and courage during the Battle of Rorke's Drift in 1879, fighting the fierce Zulu forces. To this day, they hold the record of most Victoria Crosses gained in a single 12-hour battle. The Daring bloodline is ingrained in the DNA of Pluckley, with many of the relatives laid to rest in the Daring chapel and tomb within the St. Nicholas Church. This site has been known to display a range of unexplainable phenomena, such as a dancing light that bounces around the chapel, even when no sunlight is present. This is twinned with the ominous sounds of a deep knocking coming from the burial vaults beneath the stone floor. The church has regularly been the site of peculiar apparitions, and even subject to investigations from paranormal societies. One particular event took place in the early 1970s, when the Reverend John Pittock allowed a group of psychic researchers to spend the night locked inside the church. The group were equipped with cameras and tape recorders, determined to catch some of the suspected paranormal activity. Supposedly the next morning, the Reverend unlocked the door and asked how their stay was. The disgruntled group had seen nothing abnormal or supernatural, but were thankful for the Reverend's dog, who came at regular intervals, alleviating their boredom. To this, the Reverend told them that actually he had no dog, and was certain that they were completely alone when he locked the doors for the night. Another ghostly encounter related to the clergy has been witnessed close by the church on Station Road. Here it is said that the noticeable air of melancholy lingers between a large white house, once known as the Greystones, and another picturesque house called Rose Court. Folklore suggests that a 16th century monk once lived where the Greystones now stand, and was said to have fallen in love with a lady living across in Rose Court. Said to be a secret mistress to one of the members of the Daring family, she began a relationship with the priest, taking innocent strolls down the lanes, talking and laughing. She would often take her small dog, who the monk had quite the affection for. But unfortunately, this happiness would not last. One tragic evening, the lady concocted a deadly drink made from poisonous berries and took her own life. It is not entirely clear what drove her to this decision. Was the love triangle with two forbidden men too much for her to cope with? Or did her lover within the Daring family discover she was unfaithful and stage her murder as a suicide? After her death, the monk fell into a pit of grief and died soon after, supposedly of a broken heart. Throughout the years, many have claimed to have heard the sounds of a couple's joyous strolls, laughing and chatting in this very spot, followed by the sound of a barking dog. Although the pair of lovers seem to remain in their happiest moments together, there are other specters who are not so lucky. A local headmaster by the name of Henry Turf would regularly travel to Pluckley from a nearby village to visit his close friend. One day he went missing and was found later hanging from a tree in Pluckley. To this day, his ghost can be seen hanging from the same spot before suddenly vanishing. Edging further away from cozy, ghostly goings-on in the village, the curtain is pulled back to reveal Pluckley's increasingly dark and disturbing past. And what dark corners of the Daring family legacy are yet to be unearthed? Members of the Daring family are still set to roam the churchyard of the St. Nicholas Church, in particular two women, their names unknown, but who have come to be nicknamed as the Red Lady and the White Lady. In a flowing red gown, the Red Lady died while in labor, and supposedly wanders the graveyard crying out, searching for her baby, who also died during the birth. Thought to have been the result of an affair with a villager, the illegitimate child had to be kept secret, and was therefore buried in an unmarked grave. For eternity she wanders, searching for her offspring, longing to hold it for one last time. The tale of her sister spectre, the White Lady, is even more peculiar. Rumored to have been the wife of one of the Darings, death came to her at a very young age, whilst in the height of a natural beauty that radiated purity. Her husband was distraught and on the brink of breakdown, determined not to let her beauty fade, or her body rot. He insisted she be clothed in a priceless white dress and sealed in a lead coffin with a single red rose in her hand. This coffin was then placed in a series of other airtight coffins and was finally closed in a solid oak casket. This was then buried deep inside the family vault, where, as previously mentioned, an ominous knocking had been heard from beneath the stone. On some occasions, the White Lady has appeared to escape her tomb, spotted roaming the churchyard under a bright moonlit night, the red rose clearly visible to the side of her white flowing dress.
I was struggling to keep my eyes open. The headlights were like an optical illusion after a while, curling around the dark country lanes. My daughter was asleep in the back, wife asleep in the front. I noticed a sign for Pluckley, which wasn't far from the hotel. When I turned the corner, the headlights passed over a patch of trees. I nearly crashed the car. There was a dead body pinned to a large oak tree by multiple old-fashioned swords. Blood everywhere. Down his body, his face, his hands. The guy himself was wearing some historical clothing. I thought he was a reenactor. I jumped out of my skin and hit the brakes. My wife and daughter woke suddenly, thinking I'd hit something. I reversed quickly, but the body and the tree were gone.
On the edge of the village, A spot known as Fright Corner is notorious for its horrific history. They say the spot was a perfect place of ambush by a cruel highwayman who was rumored to have been named Robert Dubois. Although the spot proved successful for him to effectively rob passers-by, ultimately it would be his downfall. One night, he met a brutal end as he was accosted by another gang of thieves and pinned to a tree by multiple swords, skewering him and leaving his bleeding body for all to see. Various drivers have since witnessed the horrific sight of Dubois' bloody corpse, pinned to a phantom tree in the flash of their passing headlights. The wide array of specters in such a small space amplifies the uncanny atmosphere that hangs over the country lanes. On Maltman's Hill, a ghostly horse and carriage has been seen charging through the village. Sometimes only the sounds are heard, terrifying bystanders as it suddenly passes. Nearby, at the brickworks in Pluckley, a tragic accident claimed the life of a man who was partially crushed by a huge clay wall. To this day, his screams in agony have been heard coming from the brickworks. Suffering runs like a current underneath the surface of the village, and even the respected Daring family name would come to be tied with places of pain and terror in Pluckley. A malevolent location stained with the family name is the notorious Daring Woods, also known as the Screaming Woods. On the outskirts of the village, many people have reported the terrifying sounds of screaming emitting from the forest at night. Others have described hearing footsteps and whispers when out on a morning stroll, and some have even reported black shadows following them. The woodland is suspected to house various apparitions, from people who became lost and could never find their way out, to an 18th century military colonel who hanged himself. However, the family name would be remembered for its association with one of the strangest and most horrifying events in the village's history that took place in this very location, the Daring Woods Massacre. It was November the 1st, 1948. The night of All Hallows Eve was quickly dissipating, and the comfort of the early light of day was returning, only to cast the light upon the dead bodies of 20 people, 11 of which were children.
At approximately 8 a.m. on Monday, notification was received through the Ashford 999 Centre of 20 bodies discovered by a hunter near Smarton Bell Road, in the middle of the Daring Wood. The bodies were identified as belonging to members of 5 families living around the Maltman's Hill. They were piled up one on another in a way that suggests the involvement of more than one killer. Officers from the Ashford Police Station, assisted by Detective Chief Inspector Connell Murray, are investigating the area right now. No wounds were found on the bodies, and the cause of death is still unknown. We are waiting on an autopsy, though we can already state that they died just hours before the discovery today. We'll start questioning all the people living in the area, said DCI Murray. This tragic discovery could be linked to the still unexplained phenomenon of lights coming from the forest that many people witnessed the night before the murder.
Soon after, the local authorities closed the case, stating that the cause was carbon monoxide poisoning. This was challenged at the time, leading to the police themselves being under suspicion of involvement in the massacre, although this was never proven. Half a century later, on Halloween night of 1998, 4 college students vanished after spending the night in the Daring Woods. No bodies were ever found, and after 3 weeks the police once again closed the case. However, the people of Pluckley would once again report seeing strange lights in the forest on the night of the students' disappearance. One witness described these as figures of light, similar to spider webs. Bluckley's most haunted status is certainly hard to contest, with countless encounters and a trove of disturbing and unexplainable events. Along with the intentions and influence of a prominent bloodline, the daring name will always have a hold over the village of Bluckley. However, the real question is down to how much of the supernatural occurrences fall on the shoulders of the unspoken and often disturbing secrets kept behind the closed doors of the affluent aristocratic family.
It was the night of the Gold Cup. Me and the girls were staying in Presbury at the King's Arms, stone's throw away from the racecourse. Kate had won big, so we were in for a hell of a night. We were getting some air out by the road when we saw a jockey in his full attire. It was baffling, as the races had finished hours before. I wasn't sure if he was on a stag do or something. As we chuckled to ourselves, we watched as the jockey stepped off the pavement and crossed the road. Halfway across, he just vanished into thin air. Our smiles quickly fell away as me and the other three girls crossed the road to check and see where he went, and he was just gone. We turned back to the warm lights of the bustling pub, and there he was, back on the pavement outside the King's Arms. He looked up and went across the road, exactly like before. Halfway across, he vanished, just like before.
Can human emotion and tragic events doom a soul to be stranded on this earth long after death? Or could there be a more viable and scientific explanation that, instead of disproving the existence of ghosts, validates it in a far more believable way? The best example that could lead us to this conclusion is also claimed to be one of the most haunted villages in England, Presbury in Gloucestershire. On the outskirts of the town of Cheltenham, Presbury is known for its characterful cottages, vibrant community, and hauntings in abundance. Almost every street and many of the houses are tied to ghostly sightings, ranging from entire phantom funeral processions to murdered messengers from the War of the Roses. These eerie incidents have been reported from both locals and visitors for centuries. Among the array of specters is a series of sinister older women, sure to provoke nightmares to the bravest of souls. On Mill Street, a regular encounter sees the spirit of the long-dead Mrs. Priest, who is spotted on misty mornings floating across the field until she reaches the wall on the opposite side. Here, Mrs. Priest swiftly vanishes before the onlooker's eyes. Another woman haunts Anne Goodrich Close, a collection of almshouses from the 1720s. This frail old lady has been spotted on multiple occasions, dressed in old-fashioned attire, peering through the windows of the houses. Could this be Anne Goodrich herself, curious about those who now live on her road? Lastly, in the Tudor manor house, Ellenborough Park, A terrifying matron lurks in the corridors of the seemingly plush accommodation. The hotel used to be the Oriole Girls' School, but was closed down in the early 1970s. Supposedly a matron would take care of the girls, keeping them to a strict routine. For some unknown reason, it is believed that the matron hung herself in one of the bedrooms, and to this day she continues to roam the corridors, ensuring that all the girls under her care are asleep in their beds. Also in this hotel, one room in particular is said to be extremely haunted, with 13 people complaining about an ungodly presence in room 56. This was the room of the long-dead Lady Ellenborough, whose portrait hangs on the red walls to this very day. One of the reasons that Presbury is so renowned for its haunted status lies in the fact that all of the instances and specters occur within its tiny 3-kilometer radius. Dozens of individual specters have been spotted, only often a couple of houses and sometimes even meters apart. With the village being such a hotbed of paranormal activity, there has always been a desire to connect these incidents and encounters, and to explain what makes Presbury so susceptible to hauntings. The most well-known entity, and in many ways a staple of the village of Presbury, is the notorious Black Abbot, who haunts the graveyard of the St. Mary's Church from the 12th century. Dressed in a dark hooded cloak, this apparition is usually spotted on Christmas, Easter, and All Souls' Day, walking the same route, leaving the church and crossing the churchyard through the grounds of the old priory. He turns a corner and walks down to a cottage on the high street, where he passes through the wall and into the house. Whilst on this route, some people have seen cars and bikes swerve to avoid him. His journey ends in the attic of the cottage, where it is reported he noisily moves things around. This cottage, also known as the Reform Cottage, was the home to the abbot and was even once a burial ground for monks. Supposedly captured on camera by Derek Stafford in 1990, the photographer was taking pictures of the gravestones under the floodlights of the church. However, when he was developing the images, he saw a dark figure standing beyond one of the graves. The tale was the inspiration behind a successful crime novel named after the eponymous character in 1926 by the British writer Edgar Wallace. The story was about a ruined abbey, haunted by the ghost of an abbot protecting his secret treasure. This was then adapted for film and television on multiple occasions. The Black Abbot is certainly a sinister entity, but he also may be the gateway into a greater understanding of the through line between the hauntings in Presbury. Many have speculated about the spirit's inability to differ from its walking route, seemingly set in stone. This begs the question of whether this entity is trapped in a never-ending loop, or alternatively, that this may be simply the replaying of an event from long ago. Many, if not all of the apparitions reported, seem to be on some sort of loop, with the same actions seen multiple times over decades. For instance, another lady is seen gathering sticks and passing by the windows of a cottage, over and over again. One of the most striking sightings reported was of an entire funeral procession spotted by a local teacher who was returning home after work. The Victorian group of mourners with black horses was slowly crossing a field towards the teacher. As she turned her car around in respect, the entire procession vanished in her rearview mirror. Could these moments from history be stranded in time somehow? The respected philosopher Henry H. Price proposed the theory in the early 20th century that it was possible for memories and thoughts to be stored in another realm, a place unseen to the naked eye. Price believed that psychics could infiltrate this realm and relay the memories stored there. The theory also began to question whether the memory could imprint itself on the location where it happened, or even a set of specific conditions associated with the event. In 1961, the theory of place memory was furthered by writer Thomas Charles Lethbridge in his book Ghost and Ghoul. The book catalogued Charles's personal paranormal experiences during his time spent as an archaeologist. He was a man of science looking for a logical explanation, and his proposed argument leaned towards the idea that memory imprinting may be possible if stored in fields of energy. He believed that when humans encountered this field of energy, it unlocked the memory within and resulted in a paranormal event. In 1972, Lethbridge's book inspired a motion picture called The Stone Tape, which followed a team of researchers discovering how memories could be recorded on the stones of a Victorian stately home. The title refers to a videotape recording playing on a loop and appearing as some sort of haunting. This transcended the realm of cinema to become a widely acknowledged and believed explanation for the existence of ghosts. More substance was given to this theory, with many citing the significance of ancient standing stones and stone circles at the center of many cultural and spiritual beliefs from past civilizations. Presbury does appear to be one of the best examples in the UK of a collection of apparitions adhering to the stone tape explanation, with echoes of historical events staining the stones of the cottages. With all these apparitions existing within such a small radius, it does open the possibility that this area channels energy in some strange way. Many spectral sightings are associated with centuries of war and bloodshed, events that could surely impact on the energy of an area. Throughout the centuries, it is thought that Presbury acted as a crossroads during many conflicts in this part of the country. Could this be a reason that Presbury is a place where the worlds of the living and the dead collide? Multiple encounters have been recorded of ghostly horsemen suspected to have been killed here. The first has been sighted on Shaw Green Lane in the early hours of spring mornings, galloping on a white horse along the street before vanishing. This ghost rider is suspected to have been one of Edward IV's messengers from the late 1400s, during the infamous War of the Roses. Whilst en route to deliver a message, he was shot off his horse by a Lancastrian archer. This was largely confirmed in the early 20th century, when road workers discovered a skeleton with an arrowhead lodged in between his ribs. One of the reported details of this entity is that with every sighting, the spirit appears to be fading away a little more every time, like an aging film reel. Another horseman has been reported on the oldest street in the village, called the Burgage. During the English Civil War, Presbury was believed to have been occupied by parliamentarian soldiers looking to intercept royalist forces travelling to Gloucester. When night fell, they would tie a rope across the road to incapacitate enemy riders. This proved successful on one particular night when the royalist messenger was yanked off his horse, falling into the clutches of the parliamentarian soldiers who proceeded to execute him. Various witnesses have claimed to have heard the heavy hoofs of a horse galloping down the Burgage in the dead of night, before suddenly halting, perhaps at the place of the horseman's brutal demise. Early one morning on Mill Street, a man walking his dog reported hearing the sounds of a group of men marching down the street towards him. When he looked into the misty road ahead, he could see no one. The sounds continued to grow closer when the dog sank to the ground in fear. At this moment, the marching suddenly stopped. This incident has been reported on multiple occasions. This particular encounter opens up a new type of haunting said to regularly occur in Presbury. These hauntings are mainly audible and may help to further our understanding of the potential stone tape effects on the village. A series of musical encounters have been reported to have taken place in the Sundial Cottage, with multiple sightings of a young girl in the hazy sunlight playing a small piano known as a spinet. Others have reported the music on its own, mysteriously playing with no apparent musician. This always seems to occur on sunny days. One particular encounter was reported during the Second World War by a mother and 2 children who moved into the Sundial Cottage to escape the incoming Blitz. Whilst in the house, the 2 children kept telling their mother that they were afraid of the music that played in their room at night. After a while of the children complaining, the mother swapped rooms with them. She soon found herself waking in the dead of night to the phantom music. These audio hauntings can be certainly seen as intriguing examples in support of the stone tape theory. The compelling question of whether audio can be recorded onto a location in a similar way as a visual is in some ways even easier to comprehend. There are very clear examples of how sound can be manipulated by its surroundings. One of the best being how an echo acts as a replicate of the original sound. Echoes also travel great distances and even time, with delays depending on the terrain. Perhaps an echo could enter another form of energy field, retaining its information such as voice, pitch, or cadence. But even if Presbury is built upon some sort of mysterious amalgamation of energy, resulting in moments in time being recorded, how are they replayed? With each event reported multiple times, and those reports describing identical encounters, there is another continuous through line: the description of the weather at the time of the paranormal event. It is very common that specific weather conditions were documented according to a particular haunting, and this then being repeated over various sightings. For instance, the misty morning backdrop to the marching men of Mill Street, or the hazy sunlight with the little girl at Sundial Cottage. Could the weather be a factor for the resurgence of these events, replicating the atmosphere of those exact moments lost in time? According to the stone tape theory, when specific conditions are replicated from the time the recording was made, this can allow the memory to be replayed. An apt parallel would be the tuning of a radio, with the signal slowly becoming clearer the closer you get. When these various environmental factors come together, this allows the memory to present itself. There does appear to be intriguing arguments for the validity of the stone tape theory being present in Presbury. However, is it our inherent fear of the end that causes us to look to the more optimistic idea of our lives living on after death? Can we ever rule out the notion that these apparitions are in fact sentient beings, trapped and doomed to relive their darkest moments until the end of days?
It was 1870 when I first raced. I was 4 stone 11 pounds, 13 years old. Athol Daisy was the first horse I rode to victory, the first of 8,000 rides. 2,700 of those I won. In 1873 I won the Liverpool Autumn Cup, and the owner presented me with this beautiful short-barreled revolver. I won't lie, after that the money came flooding in, and boy was I on top of the world. Everyone started calling me the Tin Man. But those who cared for me, I was just the same old Fred. Fred Archer.
Just beyond Presbury is the famous Cheltenham Racecourse, a place where a man called Fred Archer became one of the greatest jockeys to have ever lived. With an impressive career in a short space of time, Archer's race wins led him to be known countrywide and to become incredibly wealthy, with an annual income of around £10,000, now equivalent to around 1.2 million. His nickname, the Tin Man, came from the Victorian slang word for money. But this impressive life and career would not be the only thing Fred is remembered for. In 1884, a year after Fred married Helen Rose Dawson, she gave birth to their firstborn son, who died after only a few hours. Later that year, Helen became pregnant again and gave birth to a girl in November. However, a day later, Helen died in Fred's arms due to complications during the birth. After winning the Derby in 1885, many believed that Fred was overcoming his grief. However, his continuous issues with his weight and with alcohol were a clear sign he was still struggling. After falling into a financial pit from betting on his own horse and losing, Fred came down with a terrible fever. His sister was taking care of him at his residence in Newmarket. One day, while she was with Fred in his room, he asked her to send the nurse away. His sister was staring out of the window when Fred clambered out of the bed and said, "Are they coming?" At this point, his sister noticed Fred had the 1873 prize revolver in his hand. She dived towards him to grab the gun, but Fred put it in his mouth and fired. Fred died at the age of 29, 2 years and a day after the death of his beloved wife. Tens of thousands lined the streets for his funeral. Fred grew up in the King's Arms pub in Presbury, previously managed by his father. The pub is said to exhibit strange occurrences with voices heard upstairs when there is no one in the building, and a shadowy figure that passes the entrance to the restaurant. However, it was the night of the Gold Cup in the 1970s, when 4 women stood just outside the King's Arms, saw a man wearing a jockey's outfit. The man crossed the road and halfway into the street, he disappeared. Baffled by the sight, the group of women went across to see where the man had gone. At this moment, they turned back to the pub to witness exactly the same event as if on repeat. The jockey crossing the road in the same spot and disappearing halfway. With all of the pain and suffering Fred Archer experienced in his final years, it would be understandable to see how this could taint his once bright and prosperous life. But it appears that Presbury does not see it this way, capturing a moment from the highest point in Fred's life. Although some of the moments captured in this village are embedded with some sort of negative energy, any sense of evil we project onto these encounters may only be born out of fear of the unknown. Perhaps there is no malevolence here, but simply the perfect combination of elements resulting in pieces of people's lives throughout history being replayed for generations to come.
A word of fear, first whimpering, dubious, low, then lost, then firm and clear, a menacing woe, till out it burst, a dreadful cry of death. The plague. The plague.
In 1665, the population of England bore witness to the last major epidemic of the bubonic plague. The world had seen various spikes of the disease since the Middle Ages, with the infamous outbreaks of the Black Death in the 1340s. This was followed by fairly regular resurgences of similar strains in the following centuries, reminding civilization that this killer was far from being eradicated. At this time, the land was ridden with fear, not only of the horrific symptoms of the plague, but also from a spiritual perspective. The majority of people believed that they were being punished by God for the sins of man. With this, there was nothing left to do but repent and wait for death to come knocking at their door. From 1665 to 1666, the plague would claim the lives of over 68,500 people, with an additional 30,000 deaths suspected to be unrecorded. The capital city saw the brunt of the infection, with 1 in 5 Londoners thought to have died. Predominantly, these were also the victims of poverty, with the many wealthier members of society leaving the city to their country residences. It was important for businesses to continue to operate in these trying times. However, with trade routes being mismanaged and precautions far from what they should have been, the urban disease began to travel outside of heavily populated areas and silently began to invade the English countryside. In early August of 1665, deep in the rolling hills and valleys of Derbyshire lay the quiet village of Eyam. This idyllic and peaceful community, along with the surrounding areas, were mostly made up of farming families. Free from the hustle and bustle of the city, they made ends meet by trading locally. The summer would have seen children play as the villagers' crops thrived. But storm clouds gathered in the distance. Towards the end of August 1665, a package arrived in the village. A tailor named Alexander Hatfield was expecting some expensive cloth from his usual supplier. His assistant, the young George Vickers, opened the package, upon which he found the cloth to be damp. He stretched out the cloth and hung it by the fire, so it could air. Little did he know, he was in fact breathing life back into plague-infested fleas and bacteria that was infesting the cloth. By the 7th of September, George Vickers was dead and buried, the first to fall victim to the unholy disease. Within days, the other members of the Hatfield household became sick, and word spread around the village that the plague had arrived in Eyam. With fear and panic beginning to ripple through the families, the local priest, Reverend William Mompesson, and his predecessor Thomas Stanley decided to act. They gathered the villagers together at a nearby cave known as Cucklet Delph to discuss the incoming disaster. The space was one of reverence and had a spiritual air to it, away from the village and large enough so a crowd could remain socially distant. The village would continue to meet here over the course of the next year, acting as an alternative church. The two clergymen did not offer fanciful optimism or promises they couldn't keep, but instead appealed to the villagers' sense of righteousness and bravery. It was clear that the surrounding areas had not yet witnessed any cases. Therefore, in order to protect their friends and family in the adjacent villages, Mompesson suggested they contain the disease in Eyam. He went on to propose that every household should isolate themselves from one another, and that a cordon be put up around the perimeter of the village so no one could enter or leave.
Here we may strive and conquer and may save our country from this desolating curse, to stand unshrinking neath death's fiercest frown. Then heaven shall give us rest, and earth a fair renown.
Reverend Mompesson was just 28 at the time and lived with his wife Catherine and 2 young children. Therefore, he understood deeply what he was asking of the people, and made no mistake that his proposition would mean almost certain death. The meeting took time as the individuals reflected on the sacrifice they would have to make. Reverend Mompesson recited a passage from the Gospel of John 15:13, reading, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Only a few defected, but the remaining 400 or so inhabitants agreed. They began to implement Mompesson's plan, setting up the cordon sanitaire lining the outskirts of the village with regular signs warning travelers not to enter. The plague was a cruel disease that ensured pain and suffering upon its victims. The deadly bacteria usually entered through the skin as a result of a flea or rodent bite. The infection then enters the lymphatic system, causing great pain and swelling in the neck, armpit, chest, and groin. A black bruising would spread under the surface of the skin, combined with a raging fever, vomiting, and muscle spasms. Eventually, parts of the body would turn black and die, such as fingers and toes. It was very common for internal bleeding and shock to be the ultimate cause of death, ending this horrendous ordeal. As the summer nights grew dark and the autumn leaves began to fall, death continued to devour the village. October the 3rd marked the death of Mary Thorpe, the 4th member of the family to die in the space of a week. On the 6th, the disease claimed the life of Scythe Tor, followed by both Willem and Annie Tor on the 13th. Also dead by the 15th were Richard, John, and Ellen Siddle, before the disease began to take the lives of the Bands and the Rag family on the 17th and 18th. When news reached the surrounding areas, partnering towns and villages showed great support and appreciation of Eyam's valiant stance of isolation, providing a steady flow of essential supplies in order to keep the village as comfortable as possible. This was funded by a local nobleman, the Earl of Devonshire. The process involved the neighboring villagers leaving supplies at a safe distance away from the cordon, at a spot known as a boundary stone, ready to be collected. The villagers of Eyam would in turn provide payment by leaving coins in holes drilled in the boundary stone, or in the since named Mompesson's well, which they would fill with vinegar in order to sanitize the money. It is thought that the money was very rarely taken, be this of a fear of infection or the belief that the village was already paying a terrible price. One by one, entire families in Eyam were eradicated. With the death toll stacking up, Reverend Mompesson had no choice but to halt church burials, much to the devastation of the Eames families, who were now forced to bury their dead quickly and as close as possible to the spot they died. This was to reduce the spread of the plague through corpses waiting for burial. The church was also locked up, with outdoor services held at Cucklet Delph to keep safe distancing between the congregation. This gradual separation from usual religious activities would have certainly taken its toll on the villagers. Commonly held beliefs at the time thought that being buried outside of a churchyard, in an unconsecrated grave, would result in the dead not going to heaven. This was usually a practice kept for sinners, heretics, and those who commit suicide. Now not only would they fear the torment of the hideous disease, but also the eventuality that they would be doomed eternally. The autumn leaves had shriveled, and now skeletal trees signaled that winter had arrived. The cold weather worked in some way to slow the death rate, due to the difficulties for fleas and rats to thrive in this climate. However, as the season changed yet again in the new year of 1666, the unspeakable horrors continued to ravage the village of Eames. It was at this time a devastating tale of young love would make its mark on the unjust and callous nature of this terrible situation. A young man and member of the Tor family, Roland, was betrothed to the young 20-year-old Emmett Siddle. Roland lived in the neighboring village of Stony Middleton, and Emmett in Eames. Emmett's father and 4 of her siblings were among the first to die back in October 1665. Over the course of the year, the two young lovers would regularly meet in secret at the caves of Cucklet Delph, divided by the cordon, keeping their distance as to avoid any risk of infection. They would stand on either side of the rope, gazing into each other's eyes longingly. On the 29th of April 1666, Roland came to the edge of Eames to visit his Emmet, but she would never arrive, having succumbed to the plague herself. Roland would continue to go to their meeting place every day in the hope that his love would return to him, alive and well. By mid-August, over a dozen families were dead, often with no one left to bury them. This duty was taken up by Reverend Mompesson and a handful of noble volunteers, burying men, women, and children. For some reason, the youth in Eames were disproportionately targeted by the disease, with those between the ages of 5 and 19 totaling 30% of the people buried in 1666. Perhaps one of the most devastating ordeals to be recorded during the outbreak at Eames is the story of Elizabeth Hancock. Elizabeth resided at Riley Farm up on the hillside overlooking the village. She lived with her husband John and 6 children. The farmland was also shared with another family, the Talbots, who were the first to endure the disease. After the family of 9 had died, the plague quickly made its way to the Hancock household. Elizabeth's 6-year-old son John and 8-year-old daughter Elizabeth died together on the 3rd of August. On the 7th, her husband John, son William, and youngest daughter Ona, who was only aged 3, all lost their lives. Soon after, on the 9th and 10th, Elizabeth's 2 remaining daughters, Alice and Anne, were both cruelly taken. Elizabeth was the only one left alive, and for some reason did not appear to contract the disease. It was reported by those from the nearby village of Stony Middleton that Elizabeth alone buried her entire family, spotted dragging the 8 bodies from the house, digging graves in the nearby field, and burying them one by one. After she had finished, Elizabeth left the farm, passed through the cordon sanitaire, and ventured deep into the wilderness. She was never seen again. Elizabeth Hancock is the only person known to have left Eyam after the outbreak began. As the village continued to bend to the will of the malevolent plague, Reverend Mompesson kept holding the community together, with daily sermons and prayer being the only point of comfort. However, even a man of God could not survive untouched by tragedy. On the 25th of August, the Reverend's own wife, Catherine, died after a painful few days. Mompesson joined many of the other villagers in their despair, writing in a journal, "The destroying angel has taken up his quarters within my habitation." Although the village was in many ways blind to hope, their sacrifice and courage was far from being unnoticed. Across the country, villages and towns were talking of the valiant people of Eyam and their containment of the destructive plague. Neighboring villages continued to bring supplies and news from the rest of the country. Distant shouts across fields confirmed to those suffering that their isolation was working, with even the closest of farmhouses free from infection. On the 1st of November 1666, the 18th member of the Morton family, Abraham, was consumed by the disease. This would mark the final death from the plague in the village of Eyam. It is believed that after so long, with the pressure of dwindling supplies and the increasing threat of the cold weather, the villagers were at their peak of vigilance, effectively destroying pests and vermin before the infection could spread further. As days passed, an eerie silence settled over Eyam, as if the villagers were almost waiting for the sound of despair to return. But it never did. The plague was gone. A total of 260 people were now dead, their bodies buried in shallow pits in the fields surrounding the village. 76 families were torn apart and some completely wiped out by the plague. The bravery displayed by the village, led by the strict actions of Reverend Mompesson, had successfully stopped the Peak District and even the nearby city of Leeds from being infected by the disease. During the entire quarantine, there were almost no attempts to cross the cordon line surrounding the village. When the village finally cut the line and allowed people in once again, the young lover, Roland, was the first to enter, finally learning of the death of his beloved Emmet. Over 3 centuries later, medical researcher Dr. Stephen O'Brien investigated the events of Eyam, curious of how individuals directly exposed to the fatal plague could have survived unscathed. Determined to find answers, Dr. O'Brien began a series of blood tests on the descendants of the survivors. From the tests, he discovered antibodies that were then passed on to pharmaceutical companies who would eventually go on to develop the first vaccines to combat the modern plague. Medical practitioners would also learn valuable lessons from what happened at Eyam. For instance, the effectiveness of an enforced quarantine zone to contain the spread of a disease. Other practices of sterilizing items to eradicate traces of diseases were also beginning to be implemented, and other outbreaks since Eyam have seen the implementation of burying bodies as close to the place of death in order to reduce the spreading of disease. The story of Eyam has been immortalized in many forms of literature over the years, with William and Mary Howitt writing an epic 59-verse poem in 1827 named The Desolation of Eyam. However, the ordeal was perhaps best summed up by Victorian historian William Wood.
Let all who tread the green fields of Eyam remember, with feelings of awe and veneration, that beneath their feet repose the ashes of those moral heroes, who with a sublime, heroic and unparalleled resolution gave up their lives, yet doomed themselves to pestilential death to save the surrounding country. Their self-sacrifice is unequalled in the annals of the world.
The village of Eyam is also widely known as the Plague Village, and to this day holds a yearly memorial service dedication to those who lost their lives. On the last Sunday of August, a procession is led by the local reverend, leaving the church, traveling through the village, and up to the caves at Cucklet Delph, where a remembrance ceremony is held. With so much death visited upon these quaint cottages and quiet streets, it's no surprise that many have reported the village to be extremely haunted. Various apparitions have been seen in the many buildings and walking the once desolate alleyways, perhaps searching for their bodies, still in unconsecrated graves beneath the feet of visitors. After such an ordeal, it wouldn't be a stretch of the imagination to believe that the men, women, and children who died in the Great Plague are forever trapped in those terrible moments. However, with the commemorations and visitors paying tribute to their bravery, the lost people of Eyam should rest knowing that their sacrifice shaped the future, offering a choice of life over death to many who would face similar situations. This debt can never be repaid, only remembered in all of its horror and respected for all of its glory.